Sanctification is a gradual process of growth in love brought about through God's transforming and saving work in us and our response to God's gracious actions in our lives. And speaking about Wesley's understanding of the role of the means of grace in nurturing persons in the way of salvation, Wesleyan scholar Randy Maddox states, Wesley considered present human salvation to be fundamentally a gradual therapeutic process that grows out of our responsive participation in God's forgiving and empowering grace. In its most normative sense, salvation appears neither unilaterally nor spontaneously in our lives. It must be progressively empowered and responsibly nurtured along the way of salvation. If salvation is gradual and a lifelong process in which we are being continually transformed in the likeness of Jesus, then supervision rooted in this theological assumption would be characterized by attentiveness to identity formation, patience with the process of growth, and intentional relationships, structures, and disciplines that support this process. In his paper entitled The Soul of Pastoral Supervision, Ken Poley reminds us that Simon did not become Peter in one isolated encounter with his pastoral mentor and guide, and it didn't happen overnight. Jesus' way of working with this raw material so that it might become shaped into a gem is a good model for us. Poley reflects in more detail on what I briefly described here as Simon Peter's gradual formation. It's a way of illustrating how Jesus helped Simon to see, to learn, and to grow in love through a gradual process. It provides a model for our practice of what we call supervision as a means of sanctifying grace. First, we see in John chapter 1, verse 42, part A, that Jesus called Simon by name. He says, "So you are Simon, son of John." In his first encounter with him, Jesus acknowledged Simon's individual identity and directed his complete attention to him. Jesus took the first step in developing a relationship with him, and Simon, by reaching out to him, we recognize that Jesus saw Simon. Then Jesus gave Simon a new name. We see this in the last part of verse 42. He says, "You are to be called Cephas," which is translated Peter. In this act of naming, Jesus called forth something more from Simon Peter. He expanded his self-identity and opened up new possibilities that Simon didn't know existed. Simon Peter did not immediately comprehend the meaning of his new name, but he would come to know more and more as he lived and learned with Jesus. This journey continued as Jesus called Simon from his familiar occupation and surroundings. Simon responded by leaving his nets and following Jesus into uncharted waters. This, of course, was just the beginning. That's what conversions are, beginnings. Out ahead of Simon were many other awakenings as Simon Peter came under the influence of this strong mentor and small group of peers. Conversions are sometimes sudden and sometimes gradual. Simon awakened slowly, and it came partly through the hard learning of negative life experience marked by frequent correction. It was with such confrontations that Jesus tapped the inner character that helped Simon Peter find strength in the midst of weakness, to rise up each time he fell, to learn the meaning of discipleship in the face of failure, and to come finally to spiritual identity. Of course, concurrent with these events, Simon also sat at Jesus' feet for instruction, benefited from his preaching, sharing times of prayer, and enjoyed the exhilaration of being trusted with responsibility. He had not yet arrived to perfection. Some of the experiences of awakening were still ahead of him, but the identity shift was full on. A model of supervision informed by Jesus' supervisory relationship with Peter would be characterized by care for whole persons and by patience with the process of growth. It would shift the goal from the more static notion of finished, which focuses primarily on outcomes or getting it right, to an ever-deepening love of God and neighbor that is expressed through an ever-increasing capacity to reflect God's image. Supervisors and supervisees would see themselves as co-participants with God in a continual process of transformation in which God's image is being perfected in them. So supervision is not negative. Supervision would take place within the realm of God's saving grace, in which God watches over us. He supervises us as we watch over one another in love. You know, this is the growth in holiness which is expressed in real change. For Wesley, love is visible, it's incarnated, it's embodied. Growth in love implies real change in our thinking and acting. The experience of God's saving grace results in a life of holy living, a life in which the believer grows into the likeness of Jesus. In other words, it's faith inherently fruit-bearing. According to Wesley, true faith is expressed in a love for God and neighbor. As strongly as he stressed faith as the foundation of the Christian life, he was equally intent upon love as the fruition of that life. Faith is not an end in itself, but rather a necessary means. Faith is in order to love. The genius of the gospel in Wesley's eyes is its power to generate a faith that impels the believer to the quality of that type of love. For Wesley, salvation does not consist of giving mental or verbal assent to a set of doctrines or beliefs. Rather, it's a process of transformation that leads to outward expressions of love. A pervasive feature of Wesley's thought is that love must be active. It is something which is done. There can be no inward love without a corresponding change in one's active relationship with God and neighbor. Making love visible and concrete is the means and the end of supervision. But how is this change brought about? Growth in the Spirit and in ministry competence does not happen automatically. Formation is an ongoing process which requires an intentional approach to reflecting on how God is present in the people and events of life. Simply wanting to love does not make it happen. We cannot simply decide one day we're going to love. Our growth in love is a lifelong learning process of developing new ways of listening and acting. It's how we lead people and how we lead teams. Supervision consists of a discipline and a relationship in which persons engage in order to increase in ministry competence and to grow ultimately in Jesus' likeness. It assumes that growth and faithfulness and competence do not happen automatically or accidentally, but require intentional and regular reflection on their action in light of the Gospels. Supervision assists persons in moving from simply wanting to love to acting in ways that reflect the image of God by asking them to make connections between theology and practice. Supervision creates a gracious space for learning and growth and helps us to see, with the help of others, where we have acted in ways that maybe are congruent or incongruent with a life of love. Authority to increase love, issues of authority, are inseparably connected to the issue of trust and supervision. Authority is at the root of the questions such as, who will supervise me? Or for what purpose or to what end will I be supervised? Or how will what is revealed in supervision be used? These and other questions must be engaged honestly and thoroughly if supervision is to take its proper place and accomplish its divine purpose in our communal life and practice of ministry. A serious engagement of such questions is necessary if the ministry of supervision is to be embraced as a means of grace. The task will require that the church clearly articulate theological assumptions about the purpose of authority, how authority is conferred, and how it is to be exercised within supervisory relationships. The question of what kind of authority is to be exercised within our relationship with others must be addressed. Jackson Carroll rightly points out that the question for the church is not whether authority, but what kind of authority. He asserts authority is no enemy of the community, as we sometimes suppose. Rather, it's the enemies are tyranny, which coerces obedience without legitimacy. Various forms of authoritarianism which abuse authority, and anarchy in which each individual is an authority unto him or herself. A look at the origins of the words authority or superintend shed light on what I believe holds the key to rethinking and reforming supervision in the church. The root meanings are strikingly congruent with a theology of sanctification. The word authority is overcoming the issues of mistrust will begin with a clear understanding about the divine purpose and exercise of authority. Such understanding will make it possible to identify the real issues that prevent us from being all that God calls us to be. It will enable us to move from blaming the system to taking responsibility for our shared life in Christ and our growth in holiness. The practice of supervision rooted in a theology of sanctification would not permit it to function as a process outside of ministry. It would not be viewed simply as a means of getting ministry done. Rather, supervision would be a way of doing ministry, or in Wesley's words, a way of watching over one another in love in order to nurture growth in holiness. As such, supervision would not be reduced to a way of managing ministry or dealing with ineffective clergy, although exiting ministry might be the result of grace-filled process of supervision. Rather, it would be a way of caring for one another and assisting one another, increasing in inward and outward holiness. Ken Poley pinpoints this issue and opens the way for a new way of thinking and acting that is more consistent with a Wesleyan theology of sanctifying grace. To speak of supervision as a way of doing ministry is to declare that supervision is both integral to and formative for ministry. There's been a tendency, at least in the practice, if not also in theory, to see it as something external to ministry, occurring somewhere outside of ministry and in control of it. Much of that baggage is brought to supervision. Supervision is based on a Wesleyan belief that we cannot tend to our own growth without the support of the community. We grow in love through mutual support and care. Christian discipleship requires being held in love and being held accountable. We simply cannot follow Christ apart from a community that holds us in compassion and calls us to accountability. Solitary discipleship is a misnomer. We cannot be Christians alone, by ourselves as lone rangers. Only with the support, corrections, and help of other disciples can we follow Christ. Christian discipleship is a journey toward maturity in Christ, requiring a lifetime of discipline and accountability. So as you're leading teams, it's not so much about lording your authority over them, but it's about discipleship at its root. Trust and accountability. Those things in the way Jesus interacted with the disciples.